And that brings us to the Assyrian Empire, or more specifically, the Neo Assyrian Empire. The article you read today by Parker kind of elaborated how the Assyrians were able to maintain power through the use of symbols and fear, more so than through the use of direct force. And that's what I want to kind of focus on. That's why we focus so much on the iconography of some of these large scale images today. The Assyrian Empire is centered here in northern Iraq. Its capital city at Ashur, named after the principal deity of the Assyrians, Ashur, who is symbolically the creator god, the god of warfare and power for the Assyrian Empire. Now, if we look at Assyrian history, we're largely talking about three main time periods. The first from the 23rd to the 15th century, after the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Ashur becomes a regional center, and it more or less maintains its status as a minor power throughout the collapse and through Babylonian period. And then we have the Middle Assyrian period, where we have a regional power. It starts to consolidate more areas of control along the Tigris basin here in northern Iraq, and establishes itself as a major regional power. It's competing with the Babylonians here in Sumer and Akkad, the traditional homelands of the southern Mesopotamian dynasties. Is competing with the Phrygians and the Hittites in Anatolia. It's competing in the Middle Dynasty with the Aramaean kingdoms of Damascus and with the Old Kingdom of Egypt. And the Assyrian Empire here is one that's primarily on the periphery of this, and is built on extensive trade connections. But then in the Neo-Assyrian period, sometime around the rise of the king Adad-Naheri III, we see the expansion, slow, continuous expansion, and that's because Ashur is reimagined in a very explicitly militaristic sense. The god demands conflict, and so the Assyrian kings wage war every year. And the way that Parker outlines this is that they wage war against a minor kingdom to ensure battle. And that's largely because the end of the Assyrian world in a lot of these religious texts would be when they were defeated. Ashur was defeated on the battlefield. And so they kind of maintained the system to ensure success through this by picking on lesser known rivals in the region. And they're able to quickly consolidate power. And by 671, we see that the Assyrian Empire has conquered most of Egypt and has expanded into the Hittite core. And so what we can kind of look at this is see this the expansionary dynamics of one of the first true empires in history as a area that is built on military conquest and brings in a multivariate number of groups of people who speak different languages and have different cultural practices, who are all assimilated into a broader system that is Assyria. And I want to focus for a little bit on how they did it. Well, first, the Assyrian economy is largely based on extraction. We have the agricultural productivity of its core in the northern Mesopotamian highlands, where we see across the Jazeera extremely rich rain-fed agricultural zones. And they produced a large agricultural surplus that provisioned a large army. So we can kind of start to see the heartland of Assyria is built around this agricultural surplus. And then they use military dominance to extract resources from other groups. So income and goods and services are flowing from other countries. And then country A and country B are engaged in trade in order to pay the Assyrians basically their blood money for not dominating them. So kingdoms paid either agreed to be a vassal state, that is, they agreed to swear fealty to the Assyrian kings, and then they paid tribute and additional resources to Assyria, and then they were granted some small degree of autonomy, that is, they were more or less left alone to govern as they saw fit. But if you didn't submit to the ever-increasing demands of the Assyrian emperors, then what they would do was they would come and wage war on these groups of populations, these smaller kingdoms. So, and then the empire, the kingdom would be dismantled, the populations would be deported, and new groups of people would be brought in among regional vassal states. So if, say, for example, we see this happening in the biblical text with the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. where the Assyrians increased their tribute demands and eventually waged war on Israel first and then Judah. And then they resettled the landscape with vassal states, from in particular Aramaean kingdoms in the region, and basically extract local resources and while bringing the groups of people, in particular the Israelites, into domination in other parts of the economy. And that's because the Assyrians practiced forced deportation. You relocated populations as a means to subdue a rebellion. So we can kind of see this in three levels. You had military conscription. So anyone who was a soldier would be conscripted into the Assyrian army or killed. And then you had skilled labor, people who were metalsmiths and potters, who were then brought into royal workshops or brought into different locations. And then unskilled labor, agricultural labor, that was resettled throughout the empire. And these deportations essentially provided three major benefits to Assyria. They provided a means of psychological warfare, right? And so one kingdom would hear what happened to another kingdom and say, I don't want that to happen to me, so they pay the tribute demands. But it also disorganizes, right, local populations in the resistance. You move local populations around, you split them up, so they're no longer concentrated in their seats of power, and so they can't resist Assyrian control as well. And it also provided for resupply, in that these groups are now being put onto agricultural lands that hadn't been brought under cultivation before, oftentimes in the core fringe areas of the empire, and now they're producing agricultural surpluses that are controlled by these local states. So the vast majority of these deportees are resettled into marginal areas to grow more crops for the state. So if we kind of just look at one campaign or a couple series of campaigns of wars against Israel, we can see these groups being resettled around Nineveh, in the areas around Mari, and in the upper Euphrates. So these are the deportation campaigns. You bring groups of people. And so estimations of deportees from Israel alone by the kings Tiglath-Pileser, Shalmaneser V, and Sargon II range between 40 to 200,000 people who were taken out of Israel, the kingdom of modern Israel, and moved to other locations throughout the empire. And that's just one conquest, right? So that's 200,000 people over a 50-year time span that we can kind of, or 25-year time span that we can see being relocated. And that's just one series of wars and campaigns when the Assyrians deported hundreds of these small-scale kingdoms that they conquered. And this was all done through an Assyrian military dominance. The Assyrian army was incredibly large. In the siege of Lachish, which we'll talk about in a little bit, Assyrian records record 200,000 soldiers. And these are standing professional army with tactical divisions. Right? We have infantry and sling throwers and archers and cavalry and chariots and siege weapons, each of them in regimented units that are divided up and controlled with overseers. And the surest way for upward mobility in the Assyrian sphere was through military prowess. To prove yourself a good soldier, and then you can command units and kind of move up through the social hierarchy of Assyrian society.